if we took all the people who live in Europe and America, but who are ethnically different from the main demographic in Europe and America, by which I mean white people. So if you took all those other people and removed the history of colonization and slavery before that from the context, half of all those people would disappear. After you have removed those who are there because of events related to colonization and slavery, the remaining half of immigrants who live in Europe and America would be made up of people who are either indigenous to those continents or who are there through the normal reasons: trade, travel, marriage, and other types of migration. When we're talking about who belongs in Europe or America or Africa or any other continent, and the broader issue of immigration and migration as it pops up now and then, there are certain issues that will help us to understand what is true and what is simply political propaganda. Fact number one: if colonization and slavery had not disrupted the global order, there would be no need for people from Africa and other parts of the global south to be abundantly present in Europe and America. So colonization created something called the core. The core countries are the countries at the heart of global empire, such as the West, Europe, America. Those are core, and periphery is everybody else. What we call nowadays global south. So the relationship between the core and periphery is an economic one, whereby, I hope it's not too complex, but it's very important to understand. The relationship between core and periphery is economic and hierarchical, meaning that people who live in the periphery, so-called global south, have to, by the nature of colonization and neo-colonialism following that, they have to depend on the core countries to be integrated into the global economy, which is why I love to read this book. I'm going to show you. This book is called The Divide. It's by Jason Hickel. So what Professor Jason Hickel explains in The Divide is how, what I just said a moment ago, how colonization creates a global order whereby some people from other parts of the world are attracted to or depend on the core for access to the global order, access to modern life. Colonization created that. It wasn't so before, and it doesn't have to be so right now. So you create that order, you sustain that order because you depend on resources, not just material but also human resources and ideas from global south to create the civilization or the modernization or the westernization that you are proud of. You don't get to exploit the global south and then say, oh, but we don't want people from the global south to come here. You are attracting them. You created that dynamic. So one thing that Professor Jason Hickel explains in this book is the very definition of what is called the global economy or even poverty. The mainstream narrative is that places like Africa are poor. And in this book, I think it's actually in the back of the book, he says Africa is not poor in the real sense. What Africa is integrated in an unequal way into the global economy. It's by design. It's by design. The construct is by design. The hierarchy is by design. When you create that hierarchy, what happens is that people flow. It's like kind of gravity, an economic gravity, if you like. People flow from those outer or periphery parts of the world to the core. If you don't want it to happen, stop. You have to disrupt that connection. You have to let those countries be. Stop interfering. Till today, interfering through economic exploitation, interfering through war and regime change, and interfering in the politics of other people, creating diseases and conditions that simply keep the world in a state of imbalance, and therefore cause this kind of internal chaos, like kind of Brownian motion, the way we call it in chemistry, whereby things just keep flowing all over the place. You need to stop that. And people will settle. The world will settle itself as it has always wanted to settle. But you need to stop disrupting it. You don't get to disrupt and also point fingers. The fact is that anthropologically speaking, the first humans on the planet were from Africa. So that's why people say all of us at some point were African. And there were black people and brown people, as you people like to say. So the whole world was black and brown, including the people in Europe and America. Until today, those populations are still there. The original population of the earth was people of the global south. Talking about that terminology, global south, a lot of people are trying to change that because global south suggests a hierarchy. There's a north and there's a south. People like to call themselves the global majority because till today, most people in the world are of that ethnic stock, the so-called black and brown people. Saying that to say that when you look around you in Europe or America and you see people who are not white, and you start to react as if you think white people own that place and these people came from somewhere else, there's a very good chance that their ancestors were there before yours. So the contributions, not just the roots of blackness and brownness, but also the contributions of blackness and brownness to history are not well taught, need to be taught. This is why I occupy myself with reading books like this other one. This one is called The Black Past. So if you read books like this, it's written by an author who is known as Bookman. Bookman is B-O-U-K. So you know the word, if you understand history, you know who Bookman was. The Black Past is just one of several books, but my favorite, that will tell you stories like that of the Moors, the Moor civilization. And Moor is a word used in history to mean black people who come from Africa. And somewhere around 711 AD, I wouldn't say they colonized because that's a European thing, we don't do that, but they dominated Europe. Through migration and movement and trade, they introduced into Europe all the things that are now considered to be modern. Civilization, the education, the ways of life, simple things like hygiene, or medicine, or law, or art, or science, or math, or history, or music, all of that stuff was introduced from Africa to Europe around 711 AD. So you can read that yourself and see what the facts are. And it was not the first time that people from Africa came to Europe to civilize the place. Much earlier than that, about over 1,000 to 2,000 years BC, there was interaction between the original Greeks and the original Egyptians. I use the word original because if you look at the populations nowadays of people in Greece and Egypt, that's not how it used to look before. But the original Greeks interacted with the original Egyptians. They weren't called Egyptians then, it was more like Kemet or other older names. They interacted with those people and to learn from people in Africa, in the north and northwestern parts of Africa and central parts of Africa, because the whole Kemet region was huge. So they interacted with those Africans to learn the very first elements of philosophy and law and religion and science, much of the basis of what is now considered modern civilization was learned from those Africans and taken to the southern parts of what is now Europe, namely around Greece. And you know what they called it eventually when they got it? They called it Greek civilization. That's not really authentic, is it? They should have called it African because that's what it was. So I'm giving you 2 episodes in history, 2 episodes where Africans came to Europe to civilize Europe. And I'm also telling you that if you go back in history, you'll find natural migration and natural movements of Africans in Europe before there was anything like colonization and slavery. It's important because there are many people who try to explain the distribution of populations nowadays and who cannot find any reason in their minds beyond, they are here because of slavery. Slavery is recent history, relatively speaking. Way before that. For example, when they discuss the founding of America, they say there was someone called Columbus who sailed around and who discovered the Americas. But the truth is that at least 200 years before Columbus sailed, there was an African from the Mali Empire. His name was Abu Bakr II. He was a progenitor of what is now known as the richest man in history, Mansa Musa. You may have heard the name, I hope you have. So Abu Bakr sailed from the Mali Empire in Western Africa all the way to found the Americas way before there was a Columbus, at least 200 years before then. And the relics of his visit and his settling in America are still there. If you look for it, you'll find it. Look in the books. All of this to say that the world was very different before. And the original people in the places that you now consider to be European and American were more likely black and brown people. And they're still there now, only that the circumstances have changed. All of this to say that we need to be careful. We need to be careful with the narrative that certain people are foreigners, certain people don't belong, certain people need to go home. What needs to go home and what needs to stop is colonization and its modern forms. The other books that I recommend to read if you want to understand the original African presence in the world, actually there's at least 3 titles. There's a book called The Ancient African Presence in the Americas. It's written by a historian known as Ivan Van Sertima. Look for that book. Also look for another book called, similar books, with titles like The Early African Presence in Asia and also The Early African Presence in Europe. Those other books are written by Runoko Rashidi, another brilliant historian whose work I respect. Read those books and understand that not only has the nature of the global economy changed in the way that I earlier described to create a core and a periphery that attracts people to those places and now have what you call immigration as a crisis. Not just that, but even the narrative about history and how the world exists has been transformed over time, mostly deliberately, to serve the purpose of embellishing the hierarchy, to say that some people are above, other people are foreigners and they don't need to be here. You need to stop that. So I'm going to close here. Whatever country we're looking at around the world, whatever issue we're looking at around the world, 8 times out of 10, the fundamental problem is economic. European countries and American countries are struggling and are pointing the accusing finger at foreigners because their economies are not meeting the needs of all their citizens. So they talk of things like a cost of living crisis and a housing crisis and the homelessness and the education expenses, health insurance, different types of health insurance and health economies across Europe and America. The bottom line is that your politicians in those countries are not managing the economy in ways that satisfy all the citizens. But rather than the politicians fixing those economic issues, they create distractions, what we call populist distractions, saying what people want to hear, pointing fingers at some others, saying, oh, it's the other people, it's them, it's their fault, and everybody directs attention to the others instead of directing attention to the political class and saying, stop wasting our money on fossil fuels and unproductive capitalism and wars and genocides in places all over the world that don't need to exist. Spend our money on us, improve our lives so that we don't have to look for who to blame for the conditions of our lives. The same thing applies in African countries. A lot of the problems that we consider to be ethnic or religious or this and that and the other are economic. It's all about economic management. And yes, we have inherited a lot of problems from our histories and our past, but there are also new problems that need to be managed properly with new ideas so that people can have proper distribution of the commonwealth of all of us and there can be less complaints about who is doing what to who. So that's the story I wanted to tell today. It's about immigration, it's about false narratives, it's about the push to make people hate people, it's about race riots. I try not to use the R word too much in this podcast because it's a very sensitive word for some people. And that's what I want to talk about. Immigration is a farce. Well, the immigration narrative, not immigration, the immigration narrative, the immigration crisis as they call it, is a farce. There is this narrative that the countries in the West, like Europe and America, are doing the most to support migrants. And they have a huge immigration burden, and therefore they are tired and they're exhausted of all the hard work they are doing, and these people need to go. It's not true. There is a bigger migrant burden, if you want to call it that, in Africa than in Europe, than Europe and America will ever face in terms of populations and movements. But the thing is that Africa does not sell that narrative or does not preoccupy itself with the idea that immigrants are foreign. Our culture is, as we like to say traditionally, is hospitable. You can come and go, do your thing. I was driving through the streets recently in Ibadan, the town where I was raised, and I was looking at the different mixes of people everywhere. All sorts of people who do not ethnically belong, if you put it that way, in Ibadan are there. People from the Hausa culture, the Fulanis, the Igbos, and the 500 other ethnic groups in Nigeria. In Nigeria alone, are there in Ibadan, and they're thriving and doing their thing and making their money. And there are people from other parts of Africa who are there. There are people from Asia and Middle East. There are Lebanese people who own some of the biggest businesses all over Nigeria, especially in Ibadan. There are Europeans. There's a street right next to my mom's street in Ibadan named after a Dutch person. And I don't know how many streets in Holland are named after Nigerians. I'm saying that to say that Africans are hospitable people. We are playing host to all kinds of economic migrants. We don't make any noise about it. There's certainly no political agenda to say that they need to go back to their countries. So Europeans and Americans need to stop making it a point of conversation and focus on the real issues that are affecting your countries and leave people alone. And I promise you, once all these things fix themselves, you will not find half of those people left in Europe and America because, truth be told, nobody wants to be there. There's nothing attractive about those places. But it's a creation, it's a construct of the modern global order that makes people seek home away from home.